Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to ILSI for giving me such a challenging topic to discuss today. It's my first time at ILSI for some 25 years, and it's good to be back. So thank you very much for inviting me. So today my talk is regulatory challenges for food ingredients produced through novel technologies. Dr. Yan was talking about novel foods specifically. I'm not going to be speaking about the regulatory challenges for novel foods. I'm going to be talking about novel technologies as such. And that may fall into the novel food domain, or it could fall into the food additive domain. And in fact, the example that I'm going to use as a case study today falls into the food additive world. So, next slide. As a consultant, I obviously work for many companies, and a lot of the applications that I'm going to be presenting today are part of that process. I've received no funding for today's presentation, so I really have no conflict of interest. In my talk today, as I just mentioned, I'm going to be talking about novel technologies, not necessarily novel foods, although they could fall into the novel food category. And I shall only use examples that my firm and myself have been involved with. So I'm sure there's lots of other novel technologies out there that I haven't even touched upon. I'm then just going to look briefly at what the reasons behind the developments and the benefits. Excuse me. Then I'm going to move into the international regulatory perspectives, looking firstly at similarities between the regulatory authorities, what they're hoping to achieve from the evaluation of these novel technologies. And then I'm going to really focus primarily on the differences. I'm going to give a couple of examples, one of nanotechnology, looking at the safety evaluation of a material that has nanoparticles, and then just touch on the regulations regarding cultured meat as they came to me a couple of years ago. And then, as I said, I'm going to move into this case study, which is related to Steviol Glycosides. And, you know, I've been involved in filing applications around the globe, and I hope you find it interesting as to what the outcomes of those applications have been. And then, going back to one of the last points that Dr. Yan indicated was that you know, working between industry and the regulators provides an opportunity. And in fact, I've been part of that process fairly recently. And so I'd like to just give you a brief overview of what has been involved in that regard, and then finally end up with some conclusions. Okay, so see, these are some of the novel technologies that my company, Intertek, have been involved with. We heard from the previous speaker all about GM crops, and we also are heavily involved in GM technology that is ingredients, additives that are produced through fermentation. And that is a large part of my role at this moment in time, or job, that we get a lot of interest in that area. We also, I shall also speak very briefly about nanotechnology. We don't get a lot of requests from industry at this moment in time to look at new products that have been produced through this technology or contain these particles. But we have had recently some requests for ingredients, protein-based ingredients that they want to substitute for meat for animal ingredients. So we have worked in that area. And I have a picture here of one of the products that is currently in the marketplace. And then I'm just going to talk very quickly about the cultured meat, the cell-based meat, as I said, regarding the regulations. So, novel technologies, as we heard previously, are developed for many reasons, both from a technical perspective and obviously from an economic perspective. Why would industry develop such technologies if it wasn't going to benefit their bottom line, so to speak? So if we look at GM technology, we heard again previously that GM crops are produced for crop protection through pesticide resistance. But a lot of the companies that come to me, it's really regarding the nutritional aspects. So they do their genetic modification to change maybe the fatty acids in the final material, which they then want to get regulated around the world. Fermentation is a big one. So we're talking about production maybe of new food ingredients or food ingredients that we currently extract from plants or maybe synthesized, and then the geneticists do their stuff in yeast or other bugs, and we're able to produce these at a more economical rate. And one of the last new technologies that I've been involved with recently is what we call bioconversion. So this is enzymes that are produced through GM technology, and then those enzymes are reacted with various ingredients to change them into something else, which is then used in the food supply. Nanotechnology, we just heard again, and we heard this morning in minute detail. Really, nanotechnology in the food space could be used for delivery purposes. We know that based upon the nanostructure, that these things have a higher surface area, and so you don't have to use as much, and the absorption characteristics may be different. And lastly, again, I really don't need to touch on the benefits of the cultured meat, the cell-based meat, because that's going to be covered extensively in the next talk. So, over the last several years, in fact, innovation in food and food ingredient production through novel technologies has really been in a rapid phase. We're in that exponential phase, I think. So, and I can only speak from my company, my industry, where we get a lot of interest. We get a lot of projects in this area at this moment in time. And as we heard right at the beginning, the challenge really is for the regulatory authorities to keep pace with these innovations. They have to set the guidelines for policy for determining the safety of such products. And so that's a challenge, obviously, from both from a regulatory standpoint. And today I just would like to talk about the regulations or the regulatory approaches in these major regulatory authorities. I want to talk about the European Union, specifically EFSA, the Commission, the USA, FDA, Australia and New Zealand with the Food Standards Agency there, Health Canada, and then spend a little time on the Joint Expert Committee Food Additives. So let's look at the international regulatory perspectives. So I thought I'd start off with just looking at the similarities between the various regulatory authorities that we have on a global scale. Obviously, the goal for all of them is to ensure that the food supply is safe and the food that we're consuming is safe on a day-to-day basis. As a result, all of these ingredients, foods that are produced by these novel technologies are required to undergo pre-market evaluation. And all of the regulatory authorities do a thorough analysis of the data that's provided to them in a dossier or a petition or whatever. We've known from a historical perspective regarding GM technologies that nature-identical ingredients have been evaluated through the substantial equivalence paradigm, and hopefully that these products that are generated through GM technology meet current specifications. We also need to show that no impurities are added into the final product. And then following a thorough analysis by Health Canada, FDA or whatever, then they will provide response to the applicants, and then they will publish their opinions and update legislation accordingly, hopefully, if the product from the novel technology gets approved or not. So moving on to the differences, and this is where the real challenges come for industry, and I'd just like to focus here initially on safety. The challenge is that, current international regulatory guidelines regarding safety study requirements are not harmonized. So we have the Red Book in the US, which is being developed, updated. We have guidelines in Europe, also the code within Australia and New Zealand. And these guidelines, they're just not harmonized, which obviously poses a challenge for anybody wanting to get their ingredient approved on a global scale. A lot of these regulatory authorities require different data requirements and potentially different studies. I'm not going to spend any time going into what those different studies might be, but I can tell you if you want to file an application for a novel ingredient in the US and then you go to Europe, you're probably going to have to do some additional studies to get your ingredient approved in Europe. This is a term that I picked up from one of the EFSA panels, in that they've moved to an evidence-based approach for assessing food ingredient safety. I'm not really sure what that ultimately means, but from my perspective and what it has led to is the fact that EFSA has required additional studies that we've not required for getting these products through either the JECFA or other regulatory authorities. So it's pretty much more demanding in Europe than other regulatory authorities. As Dr. Yang said right at the beginning, it is also important to add that the regulators, the various regulatory authorities have their own challenges in regarding setting regulatory policy. And I don't want to go into this too much, but if we look at this from the point of view of EFSA, EFSA is made up of a group of academic scientists. They're not civil servants, they sit on panels, and they work with the Commission. The Commission, therefore, doesn't have to spend time evaluating applications from a safety perspective, and really they have more time on their hands to set policy and legislation. In contrast, as we know, the FDA, people like FSANS, Health Canada, these folks are civil servants, and their job is not only to evaluate the applications that come in on a day-to-day basis, but their role is also to set policy. So, they have two hats to wear on a day-to-day basis, which obviously is a challenge for them. And so this obviously has a bearing on the time available for working on developing policy. And hence, that's why some of these policies, regulations may lag behind the innovation within the industry. I just want to give you a couple of examples, and I was back in Europe the end of last year, and I was talking to someone, and they said, have you heard about the issues regarding titanium dioxide because of the presence of nanoparticles? And I had not, but then I looked into this in a little detail. As a lot of you may be aware, titanium dioxide has been in the food system. It's been used as a color, a food supply for decades, for many, many years. But it does contain levels of nanometric material. And so the French authorities, and why this is so interesting, in fact, is that, or why I found it interesting, is that the issues here are from two European evaluators. So the French authorities looked at some recent data that had been published, and they came to the conclusion that the nanoparticles from titanium dioxide were carcinogenic, essentially. And so the French authorities have passed an amendment banning its use in France. So that, if true, that is fine. However, the European Food Safety Authority, which is the umbrella authority for Europe, back in 2016 did a re-evaluation of the titanium dioxide data and found no health concerns. And they even then went back and re-evaluated the publications and articles that the French authorities had come to the conclusion that led to them believing it was carcinogenic. And again, they didn't come to the same conclusion as, the EFSA didn't come to the same conclusion as the ANSYS. So as a result, you have a difference in opinion between the EFSA and the ANSYS in Europe regarding the safety of titanium dioxide based upon its nanoparticle content. And for me, it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out in the long term. Will they be able to ban this material in France? What does that mean for the rest of the European Union? Does ANSYS trump EFSA in this regard? We'll see. Just to discuss briefly approaches and requirements. A couple of years ago, a law firm came to me and said, you know, what are the current regulations regarding getting cultured meat approved on an international basis? At that time, I mean, it was a black hole here in the United States. So I went straight to EFSA, to the European Union and the Commission, and as you can see, these products were covered under the novel food regulations, since food consisting of isolated from or produced from cell culture or tissue culture from animals, plants, whatever, are captured under the novel food definition. So they're definitely novel foods and they would have to be evaluated by the Novel Food Committee. In Australia, I went to them. They were a little bit less committed as to how this would be evaluated. They said that these products produced through non-traditional methods would probably fall into the novel food regulations, but they also said that the code includes definitions for meat, and so that could pose an issue for the cultured meat industry in the future if they wanted to call it clean meat or whatever. I'm not sure. So now, after 2 years, I just read briefly that the FDA and the USDA has now come to a decision, a joint regulatory framework for assessing the safety of cell-based meat. But it's still not clear to me how the safety of this product will be determined. Will the US require pre-market approval? And then which route will they take? Will it have to be a food additive? Or can it be grass? Again, that's open to debate. So in summary here, industry has been challenged with understanding what the regulatory approaches are on a global basis and determining what type of studies they need to do. And this leads me into a segue regarding a case study for Steviol Glycosides. And as you may all know, Steviol Glycosides are a sweetener extracted from the leaves of the plant Steviana rebaudiana. It's approved pretty much all around the world, this sweetener. The challenges are that the major glycosides in this plant are stevioside and rebaudioside A, and these two specific glycosides don't have very good sensory qualities. However, there's 40 other glycosides or more in the plant, and some of these minor glycosides have been extracted, and they have much better sensory qualities. These include rebaudioside D and rebaudioside M, but they're there at like 0.1% of the total content within the leaf. So from a commercial standpoint, it's not viable. You can't extract enough of these materials to have a material that will be economical. So the industry has developed a number of novel technologies to produce these compounds on a commercial scale. And these fall into three categories: glucosylated steviol glycosides. While these aren't riboside M and riboside D, you add additional glucose to the plant material and it improves the sensory quality. Bioconversion is a process whereby you use genetically modified organisms to produce enzymes that are able to convert the less palatable glycosides into the more palatable glycosides. And these glycosides are the same as those found in the leaf. And then we have the glycosides that are produced purely through fermentation, and there's no involvement of the plant extract at all. So, looking at this from an international regulatory perspective, this is the outcome in the United States. We currently have 6 notifications that have received no question letters, the same for the bioconversion, and we have 4 for fermentation. So essentially, what we see here is that FDA has no concerns regarding the safety of steviol glycosides that are produced by these new technologies. So they have no concerns regarding production by these novel technologies. In the EU, these require food additive petitions, and a recent application for the glucosylated material was thrown back at the applicant, and as I said, the information was insufficient. And this was, again, because of this evidence-based approach. They couldn't take the data from the public domain that was to use a read-across, so they said, this isn't appropriate, you need to do additional studies. So the applicants had to go back and do additional studies, and they've done those studies and repeated what was in the literature, so that's good, so they can now go back and file their application again. Additional questions regarding the bioconversion and the fermentation are all related to the genetic modification and the fact that we're looking to show that there's no impurities, none of the RNA DNA from the microorganism is in the final material. Looking at this from a Canadian perspective, I was involved in discussions with Health Canada regarding 2 bioconversion applications. And in fact, they said that riboside D and riboside M are currently glycosides that are included within the JECFA specification. And they said, as long as these materials meet JECFA specification, we don't need any pre-market application or approval. So they're just subsumed under the current regulations. However, if we look at this from the point of view of fermentation, these materials also meet the Food Chemicals Codex specification. But these materials are still having to be evaluated through fermentation. So again, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. In Australia and New Zealand, for the bioconversion, we've just recently seen that they've published a draft code for the bioconversion product, and within this code, the enzymes are considered processing aids, and these will be published under Schedule 18 of the code. And again, this is totally different from any of the other regulatory authorities that we've filed applications with at this moment in time. And looking at it from a fermentation perspective again, I really see no difference between the organism and the enzyme in terms of it being used as a processing aid. However, upon discussions with FSANS, it appears that the microorganism will not be classified as a processing aid. And so at this moment in time, we still don't know how the fermentation materials will be captured under the Australian code. So in summary of those 4 applications that we've made on an international basis, we have totally divergent outcomes. So, you know, the industry's like pulling its hair out, trying to understand what do they need to do. So in comparison, we have, in Canada, we didn't even require an application, whereas in the EU, they needed to do additional safety studies. So that's how divergent they are. And in the different jurisdictions, there's been different requirements for the levels of information on the genetic modifications. And even within jurisdictions, as I've just shown you, within Australia and New Zealand, the products that come from different technologies but meet the same specifications are going to be regulated in a different manner, which, again, I'm not quite certain why. So this slide relates to the opportunities. As a result of all of these differences that we've encountered on an international basis, and also the fact that as the companies develop these techniques further, these technologies further, you know, they know that they will have to file additional applications. So the industries come together to try and streamline the regulatory process in the future. And so what they have done is developed a comprehensive research paradigm which doesn't include doing additional animal toxicity studies. So it comes back to this area of substantial equivalence, and we've gone way beyond what is normally required, and then details regarding the lack of protein or recombinant DNA in the final product, and then also looking at whether, even if some of this was to escape and get into the final material, would these materials be allergenic or toxicogenic? So these are the types of things that we've put together, and this has been sent to JECFA for their evaluation in the summer. So we're hoping that the outcome will be that JECFA won't require a full application each time, and then it may require just an abbreviated application or none at all. And if we're successful at JECFA, then maybe we can roll this out with the other regulatory authorities. So, in conclusion, industry continues to strive to develop new technologies for the generation of new and existing food ingredients. They're committed to ensuring the safety of these products, but the challenge is, what are the regulatory requirements? What do they need to do? And what is the data set that they need to produce to ensure that they're going to get the right outcome within each of the jurisdictions? And then lastly, for the case of Steviol Glycosides, I really do believe that there's an opportunity here. I mean, the fact that we have an industry where there's many different producers of these things does help, but working together and then working with the regulators hopefully will provide an opportunity in the future for, as I say, streamlining the regulatory process. And with that, I'd like to thank you.